Hi everyone, welcome to the next edition of Conversations at the Smith Family, and today I'm very happy to be joined by my colleague Travers McLeod, the Executive Director of the Brotherhood of St Laurence. They're a wonderful partner organisation that we work with doing great things in the community and focus on social justice and really a wonderful ambition of ending poverty. So g'day Travis, welcome and thanks for joining me in this conversation today.
A pleasure, Doug. Great to be with you and to partner with the Smith family as we do.
Yeah, indeed, and we partner on a number of fronts, and one is in the area of addressing educational inequality. And Travis, we're both on the Commonwealth Education Minister's Ministerial Reference Group, looking at the reform of the National School Reform Agreement. And Minister Clare has talked about this as a significant opportunity, and in fact, he said it's our last best chance to get things right. From your perspective, why do you think this is really important for our nation?
Well, I think it's probably the most important schools agreement that we'll have, Doug. We've got over 4 million school students around the country, nearly 10,000 schools, and it's around a $60 billion system. And what we know, and the government has told you and I this and others through the discussion paper, is that Australia's concentration of disadvantaged students is increasing at the second fastest rate in the OECD. We know that our schools can create and compound disadvantage, or they can expand opportunity, equity, and accelerate social mobility. Unfortunately, they're doing too much of creating and compounding disadvantage. And we know the learning gap between advantaged and disadvantaged students is widening. In 2008, it was about 1.4 years. Now it's 2.3 years. We're going backwards in literacy and numeracy, and the funding is still not flowing fairly. Many schools are still well below the National Schools Resourcing Standard, which we committed to through the Gonski reforms. There are many schools above it, so there's an uneven playing field. And worst of all, school attendance is declining. Schools aren't always the safe, welcoming, inclusive environment they need to be, so students feel like they can belong and they can thrive. So there is a lot of work to do if we are genuinely serious about equity and excellence in Australian schools.
Yeah, it's a pretty concerning picture, isn't it? When you paint it like that, there is a lot to do, and I would just add, at the risk of overwhelming people, another thing that concerns us is just the completion rates. It dropped in the order of 6%. I think and we know what a difference completion of school makes for the trajectory of a young person. So I think Jason Clare is right to talk about the significance of this moment and the opportunity that we have. So in all of those challenges, Travis, we have choices, we have policy options. From your perspective and the team at the Brotherhood of St Laurence, what are the kind of the big levers that will have that kind of multiplying benefit in all the choices that we have at this moment?
Well, I think, Doug, from our perspective, there's a few key, there are no regrets decisions through this agreement. The first is that we've got to put up in lights the need to reduce the concentration of disadvantage in schools. And the only way to do that is to really focus how we can improve outcomes through better and more targeted school funding. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in a moment. The second is around the most precious resource within our schools, and that's our teachers. Making sure there's a sustainable teaching workforce that truly reflect the diversity of children and young people across our classrooms. And I suppose the third is to think about the outcomes we want to achieve through our schools. And as important as academic achievement is, belonging, inclusion and well-being must be seen as equally important aims of our schooling system.
So mate, just on funding, Travis, one of the things that's been exercising our minds is, yes, that issue in the public system, but particularly the opportunity to think about how we might prioritise the most disadvantaged schools in that context because of the enormous work that they have in supporting students with very complex needs. Have you any thoughts on that?
Well, I know the minister's asked for sort of big spiky ideas. I would love us to flip the script on our most sort of disadvantaged schools and to make them sort of service oases, to think about how we can really make those schools hubs for community connections and for services in a way that doesn't put too much pressure on the school principal and the school staff, but to think about not schools with gates that keep people out, but communities that bring people in, and how they can genuinely be service oases, so that there is a one-stop shop for students, for parents, for families within that community. And so they're seen as places to be where students want to be regardless of their background. But I think there needs to be something that ambitious about our most disadvantaged schools, because they need to identify and address vulnerability in a way that other schools don't have to at that scale. And given the impacts of COVID and some of the widening disadvantage we're seeing, they have to be our priority through this next period.
And so just kind of building on that, Travis, another thing that we're thinking about is, school reform in the context of other policy related issues that have a bearing on schools. I know you've done a lot of thinking about early years in particular, and also you're doing work on jobs, employment reform. What's the connection points that you see in the NSRA with those really important areas?
Well, we're speaking on the day, Doug, that the full employment white paper has just been released by Treasury. And interestingly, they talk about the development of foundational skills from the early years, from a universal early learning platform all the way through schools and into post-secondary options, be they employment, further training. And that's really where our systems have been too siloed. If I think about the work we've done together, the Smith family and VSL, it's in the early years, or it's in that post-secondary school enhancement engagement where you're trying to help families and students that have been disconnected from mainstream education. And it was a relief at the first of the reference group meetings we went to that there seemed to be a holistic approach to thinking about how does the early years strategy connect up into those first early years of school to really address developmental vulnerability. How do we think about the supports provided through the National Disability Insurance Scheme in the context of inclusive and accessible schools? And how do we think about employment pathways, that our employment services system, our skills system, and the imperative to nurture and develop foundational skills, not just when people finish school, but all the way through, so it connects up into those employment and skills systems. The federal government have all of those reviews happening at the same time, which is creating a huge amount of work for the people within the public service. But it's terrific that they will land at about the same time, so they can be seen as they operate together, not as they operate separate from each other.
Yeah, it's terrific. It is great. And we talk about interconnected systems and having them head in the same direction. So it is terrific. And I just, underscore in our own work, I mean, what you've said is absolutely right, but particularly that focus on supporting people with disability, and what we're seeing in terms of the challenges with assessments for young people in particular who need as early interventions, absolutely critical for them in their education. That's a particular priority that we're, upwards of 30% of the students and families that we're supporting at the Smith family will have someone with a disability in the household. So it just underscores how important it is to get that right. That's so true.
And also the numbers, Doug, are pretty telling. So 1 in 5 children start school developmentally vulnerable. That's 2 in 5 for areas and cohorts that we know need particular support. But we don't think about our allied health services, early learning services in a way that makes it easier for families to navigate those services within the school gate and beyond it. I do think that is a solvable problem, right? We've just got to be much smarter about how we connect up those systems. I think this is something that the NDIS review have been alive to. The early years strategy and the National Schools Reform Agreement have to lean into that, because it will make it much easier for families and students to navigate those services if they're thought of as one holistic system. The only thing we've got to be wary of is just not putting too much pressure onto principals and teachers, right?
Yeah.
And they're already carrying an enormous load, often without the same level of per student funding in our public schools. So we need to make it easier for principals and teachers to teach, right? And easier for them to co-locate within their school gates and beyond the services their students need to thrive.
So Travis, just bring it then maybe to the kind of a final reflection. So, and you spent a lot of time in thinking about policy with your kind of professional background. And so obviously the National School Reform Agreement, we've been talking a lot about the content of the policy, but there's also a really important thing about the architecture and the packaging. And so, when our team have looked at the National School Reform Agreement ones over time, you look at them and say, there's a lot of things that are right in terms of the agreement. But in order to get a different sort of outcome, we've got to do some things differently. What do you think we need to do differently in terms of the kind of packaging and the implementation of the Reform Agreement?
Well, I'd love to. I know the Smith family have made very important arguments around public accountability and measures, but perhaps to answer your question, rather than give a policy answer, there's one of the things I did in the lead up to the meetings that we've been part of is to speak to the students at our David Scott School in Frankston, which is a sort of a senior secondary school that focuses on young people that have been disconnected from mainstream education. Yep. And the session I had with these students was incredibly powerful because they talked about if you didn't fit the stereotype of a successful student at mainstream schools, you were just left to fall through the cracks. And what they wanted was for higher schools to be places where students felt valued, heard, respected, safe, understood and equal. And I think that what has been missing in the way we set up the architecture of the Schools Reform Agreement is that expectation around connectedness, belonging and well-being. Now, the federal government have the Measuring What Matters framework. There's no reason why that can't be embedded within the National Schools Reform Agreement. Along with the public accountability measures, schools should be expected to comply with in receiving public funding. But these students I spoke with, they wanted all schools to be alive to the quiet kids that need help. And that needs to be balanced alongside the desire for educational attainment and achievement. Now, we've been going backwards probably because we have created this uneven playing field. We've got to level the playing field so that students can be guaranteed equity and excellence in their education regardless of where their local school is. The other thing, Doug, is when the NAPLAN scores come out, people are focused on where schools sit, right? And we know there is data that jurisdictions measure around connectedness and inclusion and safety. What would be terrific is when those scores are released, there's as much focus on those aspects of schools and the schooling system as there is on literacy and numeracy, because you can't have one without the other. I guess the other thing to sort of stress is we don't have much time to get this right. We've been going backwards for too long. We talk about Australian education, being an example for the rest of the world to follow, and we're at risk of not being able to say that unless we make the right investments through this next agreement.
So true. The gains are hard won but easily lost, and requires great engagement, with across jurisdictions, but equally with the wider community, organisations such as our own. So, Travis, thank you so much. Great to have the conversation. We talk about this regularly, and we look forward to joining you with other colleagues from teachers and NGOs and ministers and students at the next ministerial reference group, and look forward to continuing to work with you, to ensure we get great outcomes for all young people in our nation. So thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you, Doug.